I'm Rufus Solins. I'm the Chief Executive of Newsworks. We're the marketing body for national newspapers in all their forms. And I'm just here today to introduce you to what we're going to do this afternoon and to welcome you to Whitfield Street. It's fantastic to see you here and such a fantastic turnout as well for what's going to be a fascinating exploration of the relationship between Twitter and news brands and how they get strength from one another and how each enables the other to grow its audience. And we're talking really big numbers here. And what's fascinating is that those who follow newspaper groups are those who are particularly engaged and particularly influential and a really valuable group of people. These are people that want to know not only what's going on, but they want to have an opinion about it. And they're interested in what's new, and they're also interested in the insights that attach to that. And we hope that we're going to provide you with both something that's new today and some insight around that. The research that we did was conducted jointly with Twitter, and we're here to tell you about that research and what it means. And we've got a fantastic group of people to do that. Dave Brennan, our insight specialist, is going to talk you through the research, and that will be punctuated by some expert perspectives. And we're delighted to have with us the BBC's Nick Sutton, the editor of The World at One and What the Papers Say, and also Eleanor Mills from the Sunday Times, where she's editorial director and also a columnist. We'll finish before 6 o'clock with some drinks and conversation. But before we begin that part of the programme, I'm delighted to introduce Bruce Daisley, the UK Managing Director of Twitter, who's going to make some remarks. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. We were thrilled to get involved in this research. I think all of us, from a sort of personal, individual point of view, knew that there was a really strong relationship between Twitter and newspapers. My personal obsession at the moment is following the Oscar Pistorius case. And actually, the first party tweeting from Aisling Lang from The Telegraph or the correspondence from various other newspapers has actually given us a direct insight from trusted sources into stories that are playing out. So I think we all knew that the relationship between Twitter and newspapers was incredibly strong. But I think this research has helped remind us of it. It's just the content, the strong content of tweets that we see that actually reminds us that often the best perspective on any story is from the journalists and the people on the ground reporting those things. This is from Martin Hodgson from The Guardian, reporting, firstly, just an extraordinary image of a scene from a camp in Damascus. And the ability for journalists on the ground to share this stuff live as it happens, I think we've seen as a really strong pointer to then the considered commentary that they post afterwards. Other stuff here, this is Bozo from the FT reporting on just stuff that's been happening in the Ukraine. I think the Ukraine is probably a perfect example of how the benefit of live news really just develops a momentum of its own when news brands and Twitter intersect. Or this is James Lyon, the political editor from the Daily Mirror, tweeting last week, not only giving an insight live into the conversation between the British and German leaders, but also David Cameron's DVD box sets and beautiful kitchen as well. It's also, I think, the relationship between Twitter and TV not only helps channel news and the flow of attention, but also demonstrates the power of really strong independent voices that news brands classically have. This is Grace Dent here from The Independent, tweeting about Celebrity Big Brother. Do these women both realise they've been warring for 3 solid weeks over Lee from Blue? And sometimes it's the trivial textual elements of life that help give us another perspective. Or for me, one of the best of all is Caitlin Moran. My favourite stat in The Guardian today, the most shoplifted item from British supermarkets is cheese, particularly Parmesan. And sometimes it's just those independent voices that make news brands so beloved that they work particularly well in combination with Twitter. So what you're going to see a vast amount of data tonight, a tsunami of stats. And I just thought these sort of three things that I would call out in particular before we get into the detail. The first is that 59% of Twitter users follow newspaper brands. We were really thrilled and blown away with the size of that number. I think it illustrates really that Twitter is very much a live medium, it's a conversational medium, it's about finding out what's going on right now, and it really demonstrates the importance of news brands in that dialogue. Next one is that 56% of Twitter users, or 56% of the people asked, said that Twitter gives you the chance to engage with news that interests you most. Effectively, people are following the news and passions that are most interested to them. And I think that's critical for news brands because it allows news brands to really segment what they're saying. Maybe someone's just interested in the fashion commentary of 4 or 5 of the broadsheets, or they're just interested in the sport. And it probably leads into the last stat. 60% of Twitter users that follow newspaper brands agree Twitter gives me the opportunity to engage with newspaper brands I wouldn't normally read in print. So I think that's a critical thing for all of us who care about the strong future of news brands, is that actually these are new audiences being brought in to products that maybe they previously hadn't got involved in reading. So we're thrilled to be involved. I'll now hand you over to David, who's going to give it far more intelligent commentary than I can provide.
It won't be intelligent, but I promise I won't give you a tsunami of stats, but I might give you an eruption of insight. Good evening. When we set out to run this study, as Bruce and Rufus have already said, we knew there was a close relationship between Twitter and news brands. After all, we can see the results every day in the analytics, and perhaps even more importantly, in the content, which is always engaged and often engaging. So instead, we concentrated on understanding who these news brand followers are on Twitter, how it all works, and why. What are the drivers behind this behavior, and what does that mean for both platforms? So let's explore together how Twitter and news brands work together to turn followers into readers and readers into followers. First of all, this is what we did. 3 stages. We conducted a landscape audit investigating YouGov's own database of Twitter users to identify how people are using Twitter in general and the role of news brands within that. We then conducted a multi-dimensional qualitative phase, which used things like analytics, online diaries, film depth interviews, telephone interviews, etc., and to explore how it all works, and perhaps most importantly, what's in it for the users. And finally, we looked to turn all this into relevant numbers, doing a quantitative study amongst over 1,200 Twitter users, representative of both the UK Twitter universe and current news brand readership. So, what did we discover about this relationship between news brands, and Twitter? First thing we did was look at the reasons why people take to Twitter in the first place. And the top 3 reasons given were to pass the time, to be aware of what's going on in the world, and to be connected to people I'm interested in but don't know personally. Now, of course, 2 of those are core news brand territory: news and people, both famous people and indeed the writers and journalists. And of course, even passing the time is something that news brands address particularly well. Meanwhile, connecting to people I know and enhancing my TV viewing is less of an immediate reason for people to join the Twitter community. So in a way, we've kind of already answered the first question that we posed, which is why are news brands good for Twitter? After all, they provide a great deal of the content that people appear to be on there for in the first place. But of course, we can do a bit better than that. Overall, more than 1/3 of Twitter users directly follow one or more news brands, and just over half that number follow one of the many sub-brands. Those are the special interest sections or subsections such as things like Media Guardian, Mirror Politics, Indie Fashion, or Daily Mail Celebrity. The journalists themselves are even more popular. Almost half of all Twitter users follow at least one of the Newsbrand journalists, which means, of course, almost 6 out of 10 Twitter users directly follow Newsbrand content. And of course, we can add to that the many more anecdotally we know who get access to that content indirectly or more casually as part of their overall Twitter experience. The Newsbrands themselves respond to a clear set of consumer needs, again, important to around half of or more of the Twitter universe. So these Twitter users like particularly to follow the news as it happens. 61% agree with that statement. They like to see the news breaking on Twitter as it happens, to be part of that moment. More than half agree with that statement, and that is more than double the percentage who disagree. And they enjoy the combination of Twitter and news content. 53% agree that they're a great combination. We had similar levels of agreement around things like enjoying the personalisation aspect of that experience, or relishing the debate and opinion, or finding communities of like-minded people. All were important elements of that Twitter and news experience. So it's not surprising that Newsbrands are actually an important source of new Twitter users. In fact, more than 1 in 10 of these followers claim that it was their favourite news brand that introduced them to Twitter in the first place. And that, of course, can be added to by those many more who were introduced by their favourite journalist. And news brands increase traffic. 40% agree that they check Twitter frequently to see what's going on, specifically with their favourite news brands. In fact, for many newspaper brands, news brands and Twitter together are really important for driving and spreading the news. It works for them. Perhaps this is what helps make them such a valuable audience for Twitter. They are 3 times more likely to retweet than non-followers. They're 4 times more likely to post links to articles and 3 times more likely to tweet about trending news topics. And of course, they're also far more likely to share their thoughts and reply to opinion about the news. So of course, naturally, they visit Twitter more often. 60% more likely to visit on a daily basis, and more than twice as likely to post on a daily basis. Now, we're going to look at the drivers of this behaviour in the next section, but it won't surprise you to learn that trust is a really important part of this process. Almost half of all Twitter users, and getting on for 2/3 of Newsbrand followers, say it's important that news on Twitter is verified by a respected brand. But of course, trust isn't the only driver of this behaviour, as this will tell us.
Telegraph was probably one I sought out when I first joined Twitter, because I thought that would be a good source of the sort of thing that I would normally read.
Probably out of a sense of loyalty. Okay. Because, I mean, my parents have always bought the Times, my grandparents bought the Times. It's like a family tradition.
A big news brand tweets an article, write about a certain event happening, I'll believe it a lot more.
There's speculation on something. If they're talking about it, it means that it's probably got some weight to it.
If something comes from the, let's say, example, the official Guardian news site, I would trust that more than my friend Carl telling me on Twitter.
Telegraph, I think, were probably the first people I picked, first news brand that I saw sub-branding on Twitter. And so they're the first sub-brand I followed. I think I followed Business, their Telegraph Business.
You just assume it's gone through those like journalistic standards, verification, things like that. It's been checked, all the work's been done on it to make sure it's accurate to a certain extent.
I think where the newspapers on Twitter do get involved with the debating, certain points or issues, is they'll start them.
It'd just be me and my friends talking rubbish. I think that's what it would be.
Not that there's anything wrong with talking rubbish. So news brands bring a number of assets to the table, and like any ecosystem, it's a symbiotic relationship. And in fact, Twitter is doing a great deal to help news brands themselves become more accessible, more influential, and more connected to their audience than ever before. Most notably, Twitter provides actually greater access, increasing reach, and a greater diversity of offerings. So when we talk about this 9 million or so news brand followers on Twitter, we're talking about a pretty open-minded bunch. More than 3/4 of them follow another newspaper brand apart from their favourite one, and more than half follow another newspaper's sub-brand. As usual, sub-brand followers are even more enthusiastic than news brand followers, often following a range of sub-brands covering a variety of different types of content. So the immediacy and accessibility of Twitter actually brings valuable readers to newspaper brands they would normally not read either in print or online. So 60% wouldn't normally read in print, 55% online. And equally importantly, Twitter helps them feel more connected to their favourite newspaper brands. So we've got more reach and greater engagement, which in many ways is the archetypal double whammy. And a lot of it is to do with this links to more content. The links that Twitter offers, from breaking news to more in-depth analysis or articles, is a really important part of the process for news brand followers, and especially followers of sub-brands again. 75% agree they like the links to deeper content. And just a nice bit of circularity, really, given we had the Oscars the other night. That's the tweet that was given by the Times newspaper showing the original coverage of the story of Solomon Northup, who, of course, is a protagonist of 12 Years a Slave back in 1853 and still going. So all of this is creating a new type of relationship with readers. Readers like Sian, who follows 8 different handles from The Guardian, engages directly with her favourite journalists, and has created her own communities of interest around the music sub-brands within The Guardian that she follows. Or Chris, who follows a range of news brand and journalist handles, 69 in fact, very busy man, most of those based around his main interests, which predominantly sport. And this really demonstrates the power of the brand in a world of unlimited information and content.
Because it's being broken still under their banner, say the Guardian Sport, they're still getting kind of like they're still getting the PR from it, they're still getting their name attached to it.
Often it will take me to the website where the full article is.
I have ended up reading articles on The Sun, on their website, as a result of a link that somebody's put into their tweet, and I would never dream of ordinarily reading The Sun, buying it, or accessing their website.
Generally, a journalist would break that on Twitter first because they haven't got the same barriers that a newspaper would have.
That's where newspapers, they have to work hand in hand with Twitter, really. And the journalists and their official feeds, because people expect updates immediately.
If it hadn't been for Mirror Football, I wouldn't have picked up the Mirror.
In the past, before Twitter, I wouldn't have gone and bought 4 broadsheets. You wouldn't have time to read them in a week, let alone in the day with work. So, at the end of the day, yeah, Twitter's, because it's such a little snapshot of certain news stories, yeah, it really has opened my eyes.
So we've established the strength of this relationship in consumer terms, but as we know, it's all about the content. And one man who's done a great deal to disseminate the content in the form of the front pages and has attracted a very healthy following himself as a result is our first guest speaker today. So please welcome Nick Sutton, who's editor of What the Papers Say, The World This Weekend and The World at One at the BBC, and the man who, via his hashtag Tomorrow's Papers Today, actually gets all of the front pages directly to tens of thousands of people and indirectly probably to millions. Nick Sutton.
Thank you very much. I love newspapers. As a student at the LSE 20 years ago, my friends always thought I was a bit sad when I'd go out late at night to get the first editions. I remember the shifts as a night editor on the Today programme when we'd sit waiting for the pile of first editions to come in and then start rejigging the programme to make sure we were covering the best stories. More recently, I'd stay up to watch Newsnight to get a quick glimpse of the front pages. Now, as well as editing The World at One and The World This Weekend, I also edit What the Papers Say every Sunday night. And as a programme editor on Radio 4, I find it really useful to see what the papers are leading on the night before. It just gives me a bit longer to think about which stories we might take on. But starting tomorrow's papers today was really something of an accident. The newspapers email the broadcasters their front pages from about 8 p.m. to use in the newspaper reviews. They just sat there. Nothing much appeared on TV or online until about 10:30 at the earliest. Well, one night I thought it would be interesting to tweet them. There wasn't any mention of an embargo, so I took a screen grab on my iPad and tweeted the photo. And tomorrow's papers today was born. People immediately loved it. From their comments to me, it was clear that they liked the idea that they were finding out the news first, that they were ahead of their friends. Some newspapers, such as the International New York Times, Metro, and the Scotsman, contacted me to ask to join in. The message about tomorrow's papers today spread. Vogue featured us in their secret address book. The Sunday Times and Times put us on their list of top accounts to follow. And, it was going really well. Twitter followers started asking me whether I had the back pages too. I did. The papers sent us those, and instantly doubled my workload every night. I bought the Tomorrow's Papers Today.com website to act as a sort of repository for each night's pages. And once I started tweeting them, Sky News and Politics Home also began tweeting the front pages too. It's not been easy. An evening out and a delay to the front pages leads to messages about my well-being. Dinner parties are disturbed as I fiddle rudely on my phone. When I went away on holiday, I received despairing messages as people couldn't live without their Tomorrow's Papers Today fix. And I have to say, it's driven my family slightly crazy. But I've carried on tweeting them for 3 years now. A colleague, Neil Henderson, has become my deputy, solving the holiday problem and at least giving me the odd night off. Many people now know that if they want to see all the front and back pages of the next day's papers, we're the people to follow. They often say that Tomorrow's Papers Today is one of the best things about the licence fee, perhaps not realising that Neil and I normally do this at home in our own time. It's undoubtedly sped up the news cycle. The front pages are no longer available, to the select few in the industry and those staying up to watch late night TV, but they're available to all and they're discussed and talked about widely. There have been some worries about embargoes, and I've got in some arguments with some particularly sports journalists about it, but I'm really grateful for the support I've had from many individual newspaper editors. We're always happy to hold back tweeting something and have always respected the embargoes we've been told about. In 2012, I tweeted the front pages with the detail of the New Year honours cut out. So headlines like "Gongs galore," surrounded by white space until the midnight embargo passed, were widely retweeted. In fact, I think the powers that be were sufficiently embarrassed to move the embargo to 10:30 from then on. It still strikes me as a little odd that I'm sometimes the first person on Twitter to reveal a newspaper's exclusive lead story, but I think the benefit for the whole industry has been great. It's been huge free publicity for your brands. Through Tomorrow's Papers Today, your newspapers are reaching audiences who wouldn't normally be aware of them. Some individual front pages have been retweeted thousands of times, engaging new, younger readers around the world. And I've lost track of the number of people who've tweeted me saying it helps them choose which paper to buy the next day. Every night, the front pages are reaching millions of people thanks to the BBC. the BBC News UK and global accounts have more followers than any individual newspaper account and now regularly retweet the front pages to their 2.5 million and 5.7 million followers. Of course, the relationship between BBC News and the newspapers is long-standing. Despite the changes in the media environment, there are still regular slots on the Today programme and Breakfast TV which review the papers. And we now also review the front pages for half an hour on the news channel twice every evening, which Eleanor often does. And in recent months, the BBC is starting putting the front pages on its website and posting a full newspaper review online, complete with links. Positioned prominently on the home page, you can see from the stats that it's often among the most popular pages on the website at times, and is hopefully driving traffic back to the news brand sites and your journalism. The last few years have been a fascinating period. I'm pleased to have played my small part in supporting journalism and British newspapers through tomorrow's papers today, and I'm delighted that there still seems to be a growing appetite for it. Thank you.
Thanks, Nick. Better together is becoming a bit of a well-worn phrase in media land these days, ever since we learned that online and legacy media actually weren't in cutthroat competition, but often work extremely well together to enhance the media ecosystem and actually just make consumers' lives better. So it's a cliche for very good reason. And in the case of Twitter and newspaper brands, that enhancement takes place in 4 different, distinct ways. The two together provide knowledge. Immediate knowledge, I want to be the first to know, and then insight and analysis as the story develops. I want to know more than everybody else. They also help to shape and reflect opinion by giving immediate access to opinion wherever it comes, from friends, from the general public, and perhaps most importantly, from the tweeters they follow. Then, there is a sense of a community of like-minded people. As one of the respondents said, discovering people with shared interests I wouldn't otherwise meet through shared news interests, people like me. And as we've known for decades, newspaper brands actually define these differences better than any other media marker. And finally, it's not just about serious news. Gossip and banter about the celebrities, sports, or political scandals are all part of the entertainment. It provides both the humour, but also a sense of backstage access into the people and lives and other things that they're interested in. So, we have instant updates from a trusted source, adding to our knowledge. We have a constant source of expert opinion and debate. We have an opportunity to connect with like-minded people, and the sub-brands or subsection handles have got a huge part to play in this. And we have the banter, with witty and engaging journalists and columnists quite often driving it. Each news brand and sub-brand and journalist all have a different part to play in this ecosystem. Some can cover multiple purposes, but combined, they address the full range of Twitter users' needs when it comes to keeping up with and sharing their news. So let's just take a closer look quickly at each one of them. As I said, knowledge is all about being the first to know and being the best informed. Instant updates and constant development. In terms of knowledge being the first to know, goes something like this.
It's quite quick on breaking news, good for providing updates as things develop.
It alerts me to breaking news or confirms that breaking news is true.
It's all about instantaneous, the first place you hear about anything, well ahead of the other news websites. I know I first see breaking news on Twitter, and then I'll probably follow it elsewhere.
You need websites or print versions for detailed analysis and in-depth coverage.
I like to be the first to read about the breaking news and follow it up with content on websites, so via links on Twitter.
And we're back. There's a recognition amongst these users that knowledge begins with 140 characters, but it most definitely doesn't end there. 3/4 of Newsbrand followers, as I said, believe the links between Twitter and the more in-depth content is a really important part of the offer. Of course, with knowledge comes opinion, and the desire to know what other people think is an important influence on all of our opinions. Now, a lot of this opinion forming comes from the journalists themselves and the deep connections they're forming with their followers.
Well, I like the immediacy and personal take by journalists I respect, even if I don't agree with all their views.
I suppose I like the immediate nature of it, particularly the opinions of particular commentators or journalists.
I really enjoy comments on Twitter from journalists before they publish their news stories elsewhere.
And this is also reflected in the diversity of opinions that people are actually seeking.
It gives me an access to opinions which don't really have an agenda.
I'd say probably it widens my consumption of news as a whole, as it enables me to take a more broad view.
And it's important to look at different views that can sometimes affect my own view of a story.
Yeah, I get different viewpoints than from the traditional media outlets, including opinions that might otherwise be edited out.
So that's opinion. The third benefit is community, finding and engaging with like-minded individuals about the things they care about. This community element is important for almost half of all Twitter users and well over half of all Newsbrand followers. And as I said earlier, sub-brands play a particularly important role in this respect, as they're generally based on themes or subjects that people quite naturally gather around. That's why they're there in the first place. So those who follow sub-brands, whether it's Guardian Tech, Times Fashion, or Mirror Politics, are even more likely the Newsbrand followers to feel connected to their favourite brands and enjoy the opportunity to connect with like-minded people around their specialist areas of interest. As I say, there are few media brands that will reflect those different mindsets and opinions than Newsbrands. That's how they've differentiated themselves, actually, for decades.
Twitter helps me feel more connected to other people.
I feel more part of it, like I'm contributing somewhat to the story and getting across my viewpoint.
I can connect with people like myself, people with my types of interest.
I feel I share a lot of their ethical and moral standpoints.
And finally, we come to the importance of gossip and banter, the twin drivers of human interaction and social currency since modern society began. So the majority of people who follow a journalist, a newspaper brand or a sub-brand all claim that Twitter provides a unique and humorous take on the lighter news start stories. And even the more serious broadsheet followers recognise that it doesn't have to be serious. But as I mentioned earlier, we've talked about the 4 benefits, but they're not mutually exclusive. As we can see from the video interviews and the audio interviews we get, the same people can get knowledge, opinion, community, and their daily dose of gossip and banter from Twitter and Newsbrands, often across the course of the same day. So I might want knowledge first thing in the morning, catching up on what's happened while I've been asleep or I was in the pub last night. During the day, I might want to explore some of these headlines in more detail, watching them develop and sharing opinions and seeing how the debate flows. At the end of the working day, I might well be in an entertainment mindset, bantering about the big game or sharing a snigger about Justin Bieber's latest indiscretion. But together, these two platforms can address these need states far better than either individually. News brands bring the trust, the access to deeper analysis and expert opinion, as well as content and brand markers that can identify communities of interest. Twitter, meanwhile, offers instant access to the ever-changing news landscape, the diversity and balance to open up their users to a variety of news brands and journalists, and a means of connection with the news brands and their content that quite simply could never have happened in the pre-Twitter landscape. So here's just a few sound bites addressing each of those benefits.
People say it's limited to 140 characters, but it's actually what it leads you to, or what it acts as a gateway to, which I think is more, call it powerful almost.
I can ignore stuff or investigate further as I see fit. I think that's the beauty of it.
They don't waffle, they'll come up with actual facts from actual sources rather than some bloke down the pub over half a mile, and a woodbine. That's the great thing about Twitter again. In my opinion, he just reports what he sees. Now, he gives a bit of an opinion. I tend to like that opinion.
Breaking news came on the BBC website. Yeah, you can probably comment and things, but you're not really having a dialogue. But on Twitter, you've just immediately in an open debate, really, and you can be talking to whoever you like.
I've used the Telegraph, the Times, a bit, the Independent, and the Guardian. You've got to take each one of those with a bit of a pinch of salt, and so if it's a big enough story, they'll all have it, and you can actually read all of them and form your own opinion from that.
If you do restrict yourself to only one news outlet or two, you aren't really getting a huge range of opposing views, whereas on Twitter you can access that, and I think it's really good to be able to access that and see and learn from other people and understand what other people are saying, even if you don't agree.
And replying and otherwise referencing news events by hashtag or by the profile is to engage and get involved and share views or challenge views in reports, because sometimes reports need challenging. And sometimes it's to encourage others to do the same.
That's the great thing about Twitter. You can get in touch with anyone, and if you follow certain things, like-minded people will follow the same things, and that's how you get in touch with them. Twitter gives me that opportunity of bumping into them, as it were. It creates a bit of a community,
They're able to say things as passing comments, whereas if they're just writing for a newspaper, they wouldn't be able to do that.
I started following Mirror Football probably because they said something quite funny. They're very funny. There's a bit of banter, which is very much the thing about football. The lad culture. They've got nicknames for the players, and so I know what a lot of these nicknames are. So when I see a team sheet, I know who's in the team.
The Mail seems to have all the content and is constantly being updated and is really timely and topical. I do love logging on for the showbiz and the entertainment and that kind of breaking news.
Yeah, it's definitely got its own brand of humour that it's kind of unspoken, I suppose, but the people who use it a lot would tend to get it.
I'm seeing my full feed on the left. Next to that, I'm seeing the economics news. Next to that, I'm seeing all the football news. And next to that, I'm seeing all my friends' tweets. And as I scroll along, I've got all these lists. So depending on what I want to hear about or what I need to read about, I can just go to one of those.
So, actually, what that last statement really sort of signifies, I think, is we have an ecosystem where news brands, sub-brands and journalists work together with Twitter to create a whole which is far greater than the sum of its parts. Now, we've talked a lot about the brands and the power of the brands to create trust and authority, and the power of sub-brands to create communities and link people together, and all of this to drive traffic, to further information and opinion, to filter information, and to create communities. But in honour of our next speaker, I've kept the best till last. So let's hear it for the journalists. Let's. The content creators that bring the wit, the emotion, the engagement, and sometimes that, I wish I'd said that, payoff to the relationship between readers, followers, and news brands on Twitter. Because as far as journalists and Twitter are concerned, it really is a virtuous circle. The journalists create entertainment and engagement through their regular tweets, driving traffic and interaction, which in turn raises the profile of those individuals, as well as bringing new readers in to their content. This unprecedented access to journalists is considered important by those who follow news content, and almost half of them feel they have a more personal connection with the journalists as a result. So whether it's Caitlin Moran, Oliver Holt, Henry Winter, Kevin Maguire, it's often the journalists who are becoming the brand ambassadors and most certainly becoming the human element of the news ecosystem to the benefit of themselves and the brands they represent, as these respondents will hopefully verify.
I follow more journalists than the newspapers. I follow a few Guardian journalists, but also Dan Hodges, Emma Barnett, Tom Chivers, who writes for The Telegraph, and Kevin Maguire, who writes for The Mirror, and Matthew Parris for The Times.
A good journalist, I think, will always use the views they generate on Twitter to research a story, and then they have ready-made focus groups at their fingertips.
I find I get a bit of commentary and context of the journalists. So the Fish and Will account might break the news or give me the headlines. The journalist then provides me context.
As these people will agree.
With the Times, I also follow. There's a maths guy who does it, Mr. Barton. He does the maths one.
I tend to use it to follow journalists, for the most part. Sports journalists a lot, as well as other types of journalists.
I'd be far more willing to buy the Telegraph now, purely because of Oliver Holt.
You might have different journalists sort of getting into slight debates and things on Twitter, and that's really interesting to see because they're obviously respected writers and their opinions do hold weight or carry weight, and it's interesting to see something evolve over Twitter, and a debate be formed and the arguments continue.
I didn't really take an interest in the journalists before Twitter. I suppose that'd be a better way of putting it. They're kind of, because you get to know them a little bit better and you get to know their sense of humour and things like that, it's an easier way to take an interest.
Caitlin Moran, I find just really funny, and you can tell that what she says is probably going to be quite amusing because it normally is, and she gets a lot of interaction from other journalists as well that know her, and that can be quite witty sometimes.
So some of them are just dead funny, I suppose, because they're quite good with words anyway. They have a good way of expressing that. There doesn't seem to be any snobbery from the journalists, which I quite like. They'll all kind of interact with each other.
So, what an excellent way, I think, to round up this exploration of the relationship between Twitter and news brands is to introduce one of the foremost journalists active on Twitter today. Eleanor Mills is editorial director of the Sunday Times, a very respected columnist and blogger, as well as chair of Women in Journalism. So please welcome Eleanor to the stage.
Oh, that was a very big greeting. I wouldn't say I was one of the biggest journalists on Twitter. I do try. In fact, what's interesting about Twitter is people like Caitlin make it look very effortless. And actually, it's really quite hard to sum it up very pithily, get the tone right, not really trip yourself up and make a total tweet of yourself, which is a real danger. Often the dangers can be bigger than the rewards. So I think it's easy to, from the layman's perspective, to think it's easy, but it isn't necessarily so. I think what's really interesting about journalists and Twitter is quite how Twitter has changed the whole way that journalists work. I mean, just this morning, all the front pages were full of the Ellen DeGeneres tweet from the Oscars. And in a way, that became almost the kind of bigger story than who had won the prizes. And I think that we're really seeing that in lots of our coverage. It's not just the Oscars, the Twitter feeds about the Ukraine, there was the Obama kind of election kind of strategy, his tweet of 4 more years, and the rise of the selfie, the Mandela funeral was absolutely defined in some ways by the selfie of the Danish Prime Minister and Cameron. So I think that Twitter really changes, it's become the lens through which we see often kind of breaking news and breaking events, and often it becomes the subject of conversation in conference. I was sitting in conference this morning as everything was shifting in the Ukraine and what's going to happen in the Crimea, and someone was actually kind of having a Twitter feed on their phone and kind of giving updates as the conversation was going on. So it really has become the way of kind of seeing live information kind of in real time, more so even than the rolling TV news, which everyone's looking at. It's like, oh, are there any rumours of this on Twitter? The Bin Laden raid, of course, the first kind of glimmerings of that were on Twitter. So it really is where journalists themselves often get the first inkling of what's going on. I mean, of course, it's often wrong, and that's where the journalism becomes important. It's all very well to say you can have citizen journalists who are going to bung it all on Twitter, and therefore, why do we need professional journalists? But just how wrong or how those rumours can not be right or are kind of half-sourced, that's I think where there's a very interesting interaction between what you see on Twitter and then what journalists do in the newsroom, which is to then try and investigate that stuff, put some real sourcing behind it, use it maybe as a lead, and then from that you try and flesh out a real story. So that's a place where Twitter kind of becomes, it's where you get the kind of glimmers of news, and then newspapers flesh it out, and then it kind of gets kind of reverberates again through Twitter. So there's a very interesting kind of symbiosis there. I was asked a bit to talk about how I use Twitter myself, and I think it's brilliant for kind of lazy hacks, basically, because it used to be you get up in the morning, you had to go through all the newspapers and see what the kind of stories were and make your own view. These days, you can just get straight into your Twitter timeline, see what everyone's talking about, and then go straight into those sites and look at those, all those sites or those papers and look at what's there. So it's a great, I'm sure Nick knows, it's a very good, useful shortcut for what's kind of creating the gossip. So that's interesting. And then also there's the satisfaction of truffling out something that you think's interesting, like Caitlin with her Parmesan, or a particular view on, say, I was quite interested in the Page 3 and breast cancer debate this morning and how that was going down. So you almost get an instant focus group on something which is out there, which of course you never got before. As a columnist, I'm aware both of the advantages of Twitter and the pitfalls. So it used to be that you'd have to wait for the green ink letters to come in on Monday going, you are a completely stupid idiot, how can you possibly think this? Now you get it in real time, No sooner has someone picked up the paper than you're getting a tweet saying, how can you possibly say that? Or I had some professor tweeting me about I wrote a column about prenuptial agreements and the law this weekend, and I got a professor saying, have you read the entire Law Commission document on what you were talking about? And so I was like, yes, definitely read the executive summary, skimmed through it. And then he sent me some very, very specific kind of questions on the report. So I had to kind of go, well, actually, busted, read the executive summary and the pertinent bits. Don't think I can give you a view on the full impact of page 196, quite yet. So there is that interaction with your readers, I think, is really helpful. You often get tipped off to stories that you wouldn't know about. And I'm always really touched by the kind of things that readers will share with you about what's happened to them or their own experiences or something sad. So I think it makes it a much more kind of visceral connection between, often it used to feel like you filed your copy, it went out into the void, and you've got a few kind of weird letters and you went on to the next week. Now you really enter into a dialogue, and often I have changed my mind as a result of things that people have tweeted to me. And it's become a real kind of part of, you really know if you've hit a nerve as a columnist, because your Twitter feed goes crazy on a Sunday morning. And if it's a bit meh, then no one really cares and it kind of vanishes into the ether. So that's become quite an interesting calibration. And as I wear two hats, I'm also an editor, and it means from from the number of kind of Twitter hits or the amount of traffic that individual stories get, we can now see really what our readers are interested in at a very granular level. And we also know how much Twitter drives traffic to the stories in the Sunday Times. It's something that I think some news brands, and including ours, were a bit slow to kind of wake up to, was the strength of that symbiotic relationship and how journalists tweeting stuff then drives massive traffic back to the site and then more comments, and then that feeds back into the paper's conversation about what they're going to do the next week. So there's a kind of interesting dialogue, I think, going on with Twitter, not always, and some of it's quite kind of smoke and mirrors, some of it's a bit dangerous, and sometimes it gives us ideas. So Jeremy Clarkson tweeted last week about Piers Morgan when he got fired from CNN in quite kind of robust terms, and we were all sitting around a conference, and I thought, well, we've got to get Jeremy to write his column this weekend on that, because that had been retweeted hundreds of times, and you know that you're onto something. So hopefully it also gives newspapers a way to feel more relevant and more interesting to their readers. I hope this is going to work. Well, yeah, okay, good. This is, I think there's also some commercial interesting kind of features around this. This is a tweet. This is a new thing that we're doing on the Sunday Times with the Times, which is called Front Row, which is it's a web app which congregates together all the fashion tweets. So if you're a fashionista and you can't go to fashion shows, so all my fashion friends are sitting in Paris looking at the shows today, you can have a live feed of all the very best tweets from the fashion editors, from the fashion kind of insiders, the fashion bloggers, and the people who are sitting in the front rows at the shows, showing it to you in real time. And of course, you could, if you had the time, you could be sitting on the web and kind of dipping into all these people's different feeds. But we think that this is newspapers often in a world where there's so much going on act as filters. They act as curators. Our readers trust us to point them. We know they haven't got very much time. We curate it so that you don't have to. So what this does is the editor of Style, all her team, Laura Craik on the Times, they're all putting together all the best tweets that they can see out there and all the stuff live from the shows into this live feed. And this is American Express have sponsored, gave us some money towards doing the first one. We've got 15,500 uniques. We've just been doing this for 3 weeks. And they were sending it particularly to their premium customers as a kind of extra service. And we've got a whole load of people interested in sponsoring the ones that we're going to do in the autumn. So there's lots of the talk at the moment is about native advertising, sponsored content, all that kind of thing. This is the kind of brave new world, particularly for newspapers. And I think that these kind of platforms may offer ways that we can do that without it interfering too much with kind of editorial integrity, but also showcasing brands in a rather kind of sexy environment that they might want to be part of. So as editorial director of the Sunday Times, part of my brief is to be a kind of friendly hand to our commercial teams in marketing and in the advertising part of the business. And this is something that we're quite excited about as a possible forward-looking model. We also do it at the party conferences, where we curate kind of all our columnists kind of tweeting about what's going on there, and that's been very successful. But I think that this may be using Twitter and curating Twitter and then maybe sponsoring those feeds is a possible new way of looking at things in the future. So I will. We've all heard a lot this afternoon. I will hand you back to our nice combat. But I hope that's an interesting insight into how we actually use Twitter on the front line.
Me again. Actually, I was going to sum up, but it's almost wine o'clock. And it's my first job in newspapers was 1979 at the Daily Mail. And in those days, wine o'clock was about 11:30 in the morning. So look how times have changed. Not necessarily for the better. What I was going to do was just very quickly talk about two things, which is, I'm not being allowed to. I was just going to show you some very quick numbers about just how valuable this audience is. We've not really talked about how valuable they are in consumer terms, but these people who follow news brands and regular Twitter users actually index really highly for a large number of things. Still not doing it. Oh, there we go. See if I can do that again. Come on. A large number of things. There you go. This are more likely to buy a lot of different products. They've got high disposable income. They're very influential, as you might expect, very into social media and word of mouth and influencing friends. And they're very, very, as you also would expect, techno-literate. So a really valuable audience for a wide number of advertisers, including the American Express and many others. And, of course, the way you can reach them, Eleanor's actually finished with a great segue. In the booklet, we talk about this more often, but there are implications for communications planning in terms of targeting, in terms of communities and working very closely with those communities, in terms of integration, and particularly there in the to and fro between Twitter and news brands and Twitter. You might tease something on Twitter and then fly it up in the news brand, or indeed vice versa. And indeed, think brand, think topical, because there's a huge amount of, I think, brand-related dialogue, or certainly dialogue that could be related to brands, that is changing every day, but is going on all day. And again, I think there are lots of opportunities, including native advertising, to really be part of that dialogue as well. On that, I'll finish, and I think, Rufus, you're joining me. I think our guests are going to sit and...
I'm not sure if we got
no Q&A?
I just think, well, we said we'd finish at 6 o'clock, and I know some people need to leave at 6. So I don't think we'll do a Q&A, but I hope that our speakers will be able to stay for a little bit so we can maybe chat and have some drinks at the back. I just wanted to thank, well, everybody for coming today. I found it absolutely fascinating. I hope that you have too. I want to thank everybody at Twitter and the great team at Newsworks and YouGov for all of the research that has gone into this. For Dave for the presentation today, to Bruce, and to our special guests, Nick and Eleanor, for your presentations. If you want to know more, and there really is lots more because it is such an interesting subject, I hope that we've made you aware of the interdependence of Twitter and news brands and the size and influence of the audience. And there is much more to it than we've been able to communicate this afternoon. So please don't hesitate to get in contact with us at Newsworks. We'd be delighted to tell you more. But in the meantime, thank you all very, very much for coming. Please stay and have a drink. And I think we've just finished at 2 minutes to 6, which we promised that we would do. So thank you very much.